Ah, taxes. That necessary evil that no one likes but we all know is necessary. Let's face it, taxes are about as popular as I was in high school. But hey, they keep the wheels of government turning and we all know how much we need that. A related topic that some people do like to talk about is tax cuts. We can argue about whether or not Canadians pay too much in tax, and while there aren't too many of us that want to pay more, there's a ton of Canadians that believe when governments cut taxes, it means a lot more money in the average person's pocket. It actually doesn't, and that's what we're going to talk about today. Without going into painfully boring detail, the tax system in Canada, the US, and many, many other countries is really complex. And before you go clicking to a different video, I am not going to talk very much about this. There are regressive taxes, progressive taxes, and proportional taxes. Common wisdom is that progressive tax systems are the most fair because those who make a lot of money can afford to pay a higher percentage of their income in tax and still be doing just fine. Progressive taxes sound fancy and fair. The more you make, the more you pay. But I am sure you will be as completely not shocked as me to know that there are a lot of wealthier people who don't have the same idea of fancy and fair as you and I do. It's at this point that a chorus of voices from the financial balcony far above our heads starts singing the idea of tax cuts. And what do we always hear? The tax cut will pay for itself. Bull, it will. The chorus that loves to push tax cuts likes to talk about trickle-down economics. The idea is that if governments cut taxes for a certain group of people, those lucky people will spend more and the government will get that money back, and probably more, through other taxes like sales tax. Tax cuts are good for the economy, they like to say. Genius, right? Well, not quite. It's been tried and tried and tried. It's been tried so much that whenever I hear it, I think about that definition of insanity, doing the same thing over and over and expecting a different result. That choir of voices that loves to talk trickle-down economics is most often made up of wealthier members of society, people who can afford to pay what they're already paying, and tax cut fans that aren't wealthy tend to think that tax cuts are going to put a lot more money in their pockets than those cuts actually do. Should you believe me? Why? You don't even know me. What you can believe is a study from the London School of Economics that looked at data from 18 countries over 50 years and found that tax cuts for the rich didn't do squat for economic growth. What it did do, though, was create a bigger gap between the rich and the rest of us. What about cutting tax rates for business, the choir sings? Well, they say that lower taxes make companies invest in all kinds of stuff like jobs and production capacity things, but guess what? A lot of businesses aren't really into that. In 1986, the corporate tax rate in Canada was 38%, and successive governments since then have cut this rate down to 15%. But investment in productive capacity has actually fallen. In the 1990s, businesses put about 37% of gross profit back into productive assets, which fell to 30% in the 2000s, 25% in the 2010s, to 19% in 2021, a year that saw record profits for many businesses. So a lot of businesses are making a lot more money, but not investing it back into their Canadian operations. So the idea that cutting corporate tax rates will encourage more investment in Canada isn't really happening. Cutting taxes for corporations and the wealthy doesn't help governments raise more money to pay for services and programs that society needs. Those tax cuts really just help the wealthy. Maybe it's time we stop the experiment. Here's what actually happens when income taxes are cut. Governments look at the revenue projections and understand perfectly well that after a tax cut, they won't have enough money to pay for everything. So they look at all the things governments use our tax dollars for, like healthcare, education, employment insurance, national defense, servicing the national debt, and lots of other stuff. They look at opportunities to trim that. Libraries? Pfft, who reads anymore? Cut that. But they get to a point where cutting more social services just won't fly with voters, so they borrow more money to keep the lights on. This raises the provincial or national debt, which raises the amount of interest governments need to pay to service the loan, which puts more pressure to cut more on the social program side of things. See where this leads? It really boils down to what kind of society we want. We can have lower tax rates for sure, but what does that cost us? Less support for the underhoused, cuts to healthcare and education, not meeting our NATO obligations for defense spending? Despite all this, I am not saying governments should never tinker with the tax system. Sometimes you need to stimulate one thing or another through tax credits here, other incentives there, to entice job growth and other things that are good for society. But as an article from the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives says, regardless of whether tax breaks for corporations or tax credits for other things achieve their stated policy goals, whatever those goals might be, one thing is clear: they cost money. Money that is no longer available for public services. If governments reduce their tax revenue through lowering rates or introducing credits, they need to replace that revenue some way, or program cuts will follow. So the next time you hear someone calling for more tax cuts, really think about what that means for you, your neighbors, and those in our society that maybe don't have everything that you do. What is a tax cut going to mean to a family that's really struggling if that tax cut also leads to cutting social services they rely on a lot more than having a couple of extra $100 in their pocket over the course of a year? But is there a way to lower taxes and still maintain the important social supports that a caring society needs? There sure is. Lower taxes for those with moderate to lower incomes and increase taxes for the rich. An Ipsos poll in 2022 found that 72% of Canadians believe the tax burden of individuals is too high, but it also found that 80% think the rich should be taxed more. Well, what happens when you raise taxes for the rich? Watch this next video to find out. And spoiler alert, the rich don't like it very much. If you're interested in reading more about taxes, I really have no idea what's wrong with you, but you can check the description for links to some of the studies I've mentioned and other stuff too.